Welcome to Bandit's Keep. I'm Daniel. Today we're going to talk about Death Trap Dungeons. So this is one of my favorite kind of dungeons to design. It's one that you don't get to use that often. And the reason for that is it's a very specific kind of dungeon. Oftentimes there are what we call funhouse dungeons. They have lots of stuff thrown in. And there's, of course, your standard mega dungeon where it's kind of alive. And then the purposeful dungeon, like it's an old temple and we're going to get something from a sarcophagus or, it's buried below some ancient elder. But a death trap dungeon is a little bit different. So first of all, let me define what I mean by that so we can get into it. A death trap dungeon is one that is purposefully made to test or maybe punish the people that are in the dungeon. That is to say that it's something like, okay, if you can survive this dungeon, you get a great prize, or you're trapped in this dungeon and you need to get out because you have done something wrong, or, and something wrong might be you're the good guys, right? And the bad guys put you here. But either way, the dungeon is designed as a test, kind of a cruel test. When you think about something like a James Bond villain, right? Instead of just saying, oh, okay, we've captured James Bond, we're just going to, do the logical thing and execute them on the spot. They go, no, we're going to put you through this, these obstacles that you have to overcome because you certainly won't be able to survive. And of course, the heroes hopefully survive in the end. So in some ways, these dungeons often have something in common with what they call funhouse dungeons. That is, they don't need to make sense in kind of a environmental way, right? In a death trap dungeon, you can have things that shouldn't necessarily be living next to each other. Because again, this is a created structure that's meant to test. So you're going to put things in there that don't make sense. It's not something that came up naturally like, oh, these monsters are living here and these monsters are living here and they eat this food over here. It's more like wizard sticks dragon here. That's going to be your death trap. Okay, so before we get into the meat of it, let's talk about when and why we might use this kind of dungeon. And in my opinion, they are best for mid-level characters. And when I say that, it depends on the system you're using as to what you consider mid, but I'd say somewhere between 5 and 8 or 9. When we reach those stages in the campaign, oftentimes there's this weird place, right? The characters are powerful enough that they can take on a lot. They're not ultra powerful. So your low-level threats seem less interesting. Your high-level threats are still way too powerful for them to face in a common way. And mid-level threats are basically just low-level threats with more hit points. So they're kind of boring. So what this does is it gives the players something that is a challenge that they can use their newfound powers, and it won't just be a cakewalk, but it also won't be an impossible task. So I think it's a really good spot. And if you look at some of the classic or the classics, you look at something like White Plume Mountain, it is from 5 to 10 level, I think is where they place it. And I believe Tomb of Horrors is like 8 to 12. So again, that's a little bit on the higher level, but those are two dungeons that I would consider death trap dungeons. I'm not going to go into any true hardcore spoilers in these, I don't think, so don't worry about that, but I will reference those a little bit because they both have kind of an interesting thing going on. In both cases, there is a prize. In the case of White Plume Mountain, and again, you would know this right off the gate, there's 3 weapons that are the party sent to retrieve, but the reason that the creator of the dungeon made the dungeon was to steal the weapons and to put them there to test PCs or heroes. That's the purpose of the dungeon. The purpose of Tomb of Horrors is to, on some level, do the same thing, to lure people there with this great possibility of treasure, and then it's full of all kinds of obstacles to overcome. In both cases, you're going to run into, a mixture of things between traps, tricks, spells, weird kind of monsters. You're going to encounter all those things in both cases in different ways. In White Plume, it's a little bit more kind of menagerie style, like with not a through line. In Tomb of Horrors, it's a little bit more a puzzle. So both ways work, but the idea being that you're going into these things that a great, powerful magician created, and it's designed to test you. And if you succeed, there will be a great prize in the end. And I think that's important if you're going to put your characters, even if they've been captured, they're dropped in the bottom of a dungeon, they have to fight their way out. Like, I believe that A4, I don't remember the name of that one. Let me know in the comments below. Is that kind of thing? You're captured and then you have to escape. It's like the last of the tournament modules from that series. And again, this is a death trap. You're trapped in this dungeon and you're trying to get out. That one maybe is a little bit less so what I'm going to talk about today, but it's the same kind of thing. And again, I think it's in the same level range, 4 to 7 or something like that. Unlike an underworld mega dungeon, we need to know who made this dungeon. That's going to be important because the dungeon has a purpose. Is it some mad wizard that wants to test the most powerful adventurers and really trying to kill them, right? They're doing it because they're mad, so they're hiding treasures, they're stealing something from the adventurers, they're doing something to draw them in, like White Plume Mountain. Or is it something like there's a great prize? I once ran a scenario at Gen Con where there was a great powerful magic item buried at the bottom of a dungeon that was buried there by the good people that used it because they knew that ultimate power corrupts, right? So they hid it under there, but they left it there with the idea that if it was ever needed again, that a true hero, or group of heroes as it would be able to do what had to be done to get it. And that's basically the scenario. You go through a dungeon, you get the item, and then you use it. So again, this is a death trap dungeon. It is designed to keep everybody but the worthy hero out. And it was designed, in the case of White Plume Mountain, by a mad wizard. In the case of my thing, by an order of paladins, effectively. The purpose of the dungeon is important here. The other great thing about a death trap dungeon is it is really there to let the player characters shine. Not just like player skill-wise, but stuff that they've accumulated over time. They picked up that wand someplace. They picked up that magic rope. They've got a ring of this. They've got this certain kind of magic sword. These items are going to help them solve the problems that are in the dungeon. A good death trap dungeon, in my opinion, should probably not be set up where a character with nothing can get through it. They need stuff, whether it be their spells, their abilities they picked up, or items they picked up during the campaign. That means that if you're going to design a death trap dungeon, you can, during the course of your campaign, drop certain items so that the party will be able to have them, or even make that quests before the dungeon. They know they have to retrieve this item. They know it's at the bottom of the dungeon. They hear rumors of things that might be there. There's a lava monster. There's an air elemental. There's this, there's that. Now they can go out and seek items that will help them solve this problem. I'd use that, although this isn't a dungeon per se, in my adventure where to slay a dragon, where a bunch of first level characters go to fight a dragon. Basically, the first part of the adventure is them accumulating items to be able to face a dragon, to do something they would not be able to do without these items. And you can do that with your death trap. Basically, if they know it's there, there's a fighting fantasy book, which I have not read, but I've ordered it now because I was doing some Googling about death traps, and it's called Death Trap Dungeon. And the premise is this dungeon exists and that there's a contest every year for somebody to basically be able to go through it and succeed. And of course, you're playing the character who hopefully is going to do that. So you can do that too. The player characters know that this thing exists. They want to go claim it. It's been there for 100 years and they want to get the power. This is all stuff that we can use. And this then gives motivation as to why they want to be there and gives them ability to shine again because they'll have those items. All that stuff, when people talk about, well, characters always just take fireball. The Death Trap Dungeon is the perfect opportunity for the characters that have all these spells that they don't necessarily memorize every day to memorize them, to want, find invisible, locate object, create water, like various spells like this that they wouldn't necessarily always memorize because they're not always practical for your general, let's fight monsters. But in a death trap, they're going to need that utility. All right, so let's talk about the structure and how we're going to do this. There's multiple ways to do a death trap dungeon. You can either do you're trapped there, you have to get out, or you're going to go in and get stuff. So you want to consider that when you're designing the dungeon, how you want to do that. And it can be a combo, right? They go into the dungeon. Let's say they're used to dungeon delving. They go in with the idea, well, we're going to go in here, check a few rooms, then leave. But once they're in there, they're trapped. You could do that, which is can be tough. Or you can do something where they fall into it, they get captured. There's any number of ways. I tend to like the ones where the party seeks out the dungeon. I feel like that's a little bit less ham-fisted and it lets them prep for it, which makes their preparation mean more, right? So I like to let them know the dungeon's there, give them a reason that they might want to go to the dungeon, and let them go at their own pace when they're ready for it. When they want to make this challenge, they're going to go to the dungeon, they're going to figure it out. Now, what do we use in this dungeon? As I mentioned, this mid-level for me anyways is it's just low level monsters with more hit points. So fighting is not as interesting, though fights can be obviously had in the Death Trap Dungeon. What I think we want to do is rethink the norms. By this point in your campaign, the characters have run into a lot of stuff. So we can look at things they've encountered before or that they might know about if they're experienced players and turn them on their ear. For instance, you can have rust monsters. right? A rust monster is something that probably isn't used nearly as much as it used to be. It's a great monster. You touch it with your sword and it rusts. It ruins the weapon. So same thing with your armor. The rust monster hits you and your armor, your plate mail armor disintegrates. So what do player characters do? They learn to use, I see a rust monster. I'm going to use a club or a staff. I'm going to shoot arrows at it. We can change the rust monster to make it maybe more difficult. Let's say, for instance, you combine a rust monster and a displacer beast. Now you've got a displacing rust monster. They're shooting arrows at it. They can't hit it because they're shooting in the wrong spot, right? Or you have a rust monster that's on fire, right? An elemental style rust monster. So these rust monsters are charging at the party. They're on fire. The party can't use wooden things because they'll light up on fire. They can't use metal because it'll rust. Now they have to make choices. These type of monsters can be very tricky and weird. And this is what the Death Trap Dungeon's all about, right? Things that don't make sense, right? Things that they're used to, that they want to see. Oh, a rust monster, we know how to take care of that. But now you don't, do you? And that adds something to it. And if you combine with this the idea that they can't just leave, now all of a sudden that plate mail armor that they had is gone. And now this character that's used to having this really good armor class doesn't have it anymore. You can do things to strip away the confidence of that mid-level, right? The stuff that they're used to doing. Oh, every time we fight orcs, they can't hit me because I have this plate mail armor on. Well, you don't anymore. And that then makes it more tricky. Or they have to make a choice. Maybe they take the armor off because they have to swim. The room fills up with water and they have to swim. It's going to be 100 feet deep and they have to swim to the top. They're not going to die as long as they take their armor off, but they have to sacrifice it. Or they have to be clever. They cast a levitate spell, get to the top first. They take their armor off, tie a rope to it. They swim to the top, they pull the armor up. There's lots of ways they can do the same kind of thing. These things don't have to remove their ability to solve them, obviously. We don't want to create impossible tasks. We want them to have to rethink how they normally do stuff. You've got a rust monster that's on fire. Well, maybe first you hit it with water to put the fire out. Then you hit it with a club, right? This is how we do it. Or you just hit it with a club until your club's on fire, then you throw it away. This is just the nature of the beast. We're using up our resources. We're going through this thing, and each step the party should be like, well, we beat this, but now we have less things to work with, and it's becoming more and more difficult as we move our way through the dungeon. So on that note, one time I used trolls as a monster. And what do you do with trolls? You light them on fire, right? But I put these trolls in a room where there were fountains everywhere, and when the characters came in to fight the trolls, water weirds came out of the fountains and immediately doused any fire. So now they're fighting water weirds on one end, trolls on the other. And you can still beat a troll. Obviously, once it's dropped to 0, it has to regenerate, right? So they could still do it. It was just harder because they couldn't just do the fire thing. And that's the obvious thing. Now they're changing. Or they beat the water weirds first. In that case, they, I forget what the magic item is called. There's a certain kind of dust that you can get, dust of dryness. One of the characters had picked it up a long time ago, earlier in the campaign. He remembered he had it. He threw it in, it instantly killed the water weirds, and they were able to take the troll out. Again, using something they've had sitting in their pocket the whole time. I actually had forgotten they had it, so it worked out perfectly, but I, of course, was like, oh yeah, I want to let you shine. But no, they just were smart, right? They used the thing that they didn't use before because it's not that often that you're going to use a dust of dryness. But here's the time you can use it. Okay, so what we want to do here is we want to create a situation where the party is, and again, we're going to start with them going into the dungeon to get something. We want to create a situation where it becomes more and more difficult. Early on, the party should be able to take out things using up their resources little by little, so that when they're about halfway through the dungeon, they realize, oh, we're almost out of this, we're almost out of that. And then they turn around, they can't go back. This is what we want to do. We want to create that tension because, again, you're at that mid-level where you're powerful but not super powerful. You put a dragon against them, they're just going to get wiped out and feel weak. You put orcs against them, they just take them like they're nothing. This allows them to kind of be somewhere in the middle and be creative with their powers they already have. So a few things I would love to know in the comments below. Let's get some ideas going. Think about common things that we can reuse. Different types of slimes and oozes maybe that we're not using so much anymore. Because again, when you destroy somebody's armor when they're first level, it stinks because they lost their armor and they might not have enough gold to buy new armor right away. When they're 5th level, they probably have a spare suit on their horse, right? It's like they're not going to be worried as much about a green slime until you put them in a situation where they can't get to their other resources. Or they go through multiple shields and then they're just like, oh man, now I don't have a shield anymore. So we can use things that we haven't been using in a while, like slimes and oozes, really effectively. This is where you do that pit with the gelatinous cube at the bottom, right? Or better, they fall in the pit, then the cube falls from the ceiling. Even better, right? Now you have all this weight of gelatinous cube landing on top of you, taking damage, and you're inside of it. So again, really tricky, really, really dangerous. But always keep in mind that telegraphing, all the things we've talked about before, making sure that there's not just one solution, making sure that you telegraph the danger. Be fair, but be challenging. They know they're coming into this thing. They know it's a test. So they should always be looking at things and going, should I or shouldn't I? So anyways, in the comments below, let me know how you might use something like water or fire or collapsing walls, some common stuff that we've used in the past that we can turn into something a little bit more challenging for a higher level party. I would love to know how you would do it, because these dungeons can be just a great way to be creative. On my podcast, we've been talking a bunch about Grimtooth traps. If you haven't seen any of the Grimtooth stuff, check it out. I personally think that a lot of it's not really usable as written because it's a little too extreme, but you can definitely get inspiration from how these traps are very elaborate and how there's multiple levels to them, and just change them up enough to make them so they're not a TPK every time. All right, one final thing I want to talk about here is you may want to, depending on the Death Trap dungeon, put some kind of a time constraint. You know, they've got to get this before X. They've got to get out of here before they run out of Y. This is basically just another thing to keep the tension up. I think it's a good idea. It's not, don't overdo it, but I think it is a good idea. You can have some dungeons where that's not the case, where it's just like they can take all the time in the world. And those dungeons focus more on puzzles and tricks where they have to kind of think things out and they're really going to go back and forth. On dungeons that are more kind of purely trap dungeons, I would put a little bit of a time on it. Maybe they start at the very bottom, they're trying to get to the top, and slowly the dungeon is filling with water, right? So they're walking around that first level of the dungeon looking for the way out, and the water is just puddling, and then it's up to their ankles, and then up to their calves, then up to their knees. They find the stairs, they get up top, they're traveling around there a while, then all of a sudden the water's at their bottom of their feet again, and they know that they've got to keep going, right? Because eventually they're not going to be able to survive underwater, clearly. And maybe the fact it's filling up with water will be useful for them later on when they run into those flaming rust monsters. One final thing I want to add here, I said it before, I'm going to say it again. If you're going to run this kind of dungeon, you've got to give a massive reward. There's got to be a reason. Do not make this dungeon, as my friend KR King says, a screw job. Make it a true reward. Nothing worse than going through a terrible, hard dungeon, feeling like you succeeded, getting to the bottom and finding out that like that golden crown at the bottom is made of tin. Don't do that to your players. Just don't. So let me know what kind of Death Trap dungeons you've run, what kind of stuff you might add to them. Any thoughts on these, whether you like them or hate them as a player or a DM? Let me know in the comments below. Check the description. You will find a link to my Discord server where you can join up over there and join the conversation. We got a lot of great people over there talking about designing games, running games, and just gaming in general. And finally, you'll see a link to my Patreon if you want to support the channel. I appreciate that. I'll talk to you soon.